All right, vaqueros, how are you all doing? This is our first lecture. This is an intro to clinical issues. This is all about chapter one. I'm hoping that you all were able to find the textbook. If for any reason you don't have the textbook yet, it's fine. You should be able to follow along with chapter one. You need to get that book as soon as possible. If you've taken another intro, for example, intro to addictions course or any other addiction course, then I'm pretty sure a lot of this material might just be review for you. I will let you know that I have added a couple of statistics that are not in the textbook that I brought in from an outside source. You are going to be responsible for knowing those. Say if we have like an exam or quiz in the future, please focus on that. As well as I got to let you know there is going to be there are a lot of statistics in chapter one. Try not to focus on the minutia of all those details. Try to focus more on the larger uh, themes, bigger picture. What do these statistics mean as far as current substance use and trends in substance use? So let's just go ahead and get right into it. What's the big deal? What's the problem with alcohol and drug use? How often does it happen? Well, if you take a look back in 2013, it was found that about over half of people who report drinking at least once a month, which is pretty much an ongoing basis, and that's adults. So there is a lot of drinking going on in this country, but maybe not as much as you thought. It's just slightly over half, about 52%. About 5.4 million admitted to binge drinking. Now that's a lot. In case you don't know what binge drinking is, that's drinking. If you're a man, it's drinking over 5 drinks in one setting. If you're a woman, then that's drinking over 4 drinks in one setting. But it's 5 million. Heavy drinking is reported by 1.4 million. So the really excessive use of drinking is something that's actually quite rare. If you look at drugs, and when we talk about drugs, we're going to talk about illicit drugs to begin with. But if you talk about drug use, as far as current drug use, meaning people who use drugs at least once a month, it's a lot less. It's about 10% of the population. So compare that with alcohol. They're at the top. 50% of people who are current drinkers or at least ongoing drinkers, drinking at least once a month. You have a lot less. I don't know what your thoughts were, but it's only 10%. That includes all illicit drugs. And if you look at the stats here, the most used illicit drug is cannabis or marijuana. So here's a pie chart just representing kind of what I just mentioned. If you take a look at 10.2% of people admit to using an illegal drug once a month or so. Then of course, I mean, that means about 90% of people in the country do not use illicit drugs. That's not to say that they haven't tried drugs before, but they might have at some point. But this is ongoing drug use, at least about once a month or so. And these are some of the levels I mentioned before between current alcohol use or whatever you want to use. Some of the terms are casual drinking, social drinking. Uh, in clinical treatment, we don't really use those terms. We don't use the term social. We don't use the term casual drinking. We just use drinking. And that's it. Drinking is drinking. Whatever a person wants to define their drinking pattern as, that's one thing. But clinically, it's just drinking. So current drinkers, that's the outside bubble. The inner bubbles are, for example, binge drinkers and then heavy drinkers down there in the red. This is a line graph representing alcohol use by different age groups and age types. So the bottom line, you would maybe think that teenagers, 12 to 17, drink a lot. They do quite, but it's 20%. If you look at the other age groups, For example, hey, look at the age group 18 to 25, which is probably where a lot of you all find yourselves in that age group. You actually represent the highest, the most frequent drinkers in this country. And these dates down here, they end at 2014, but they go back several years, and it's been pretty consistent. Drinking for Here's one kind of victory. You can see that teenage drinking has actually been going down a bit, as has drinking among college students. Drinking among college students has actually been going down. It's not a great decrease, but it's been happening. All right, so then we're just going to do a quick review of illicit drug use. Again, you need to read the textbook because there's a lot more information about all these different drug types in the textbook that you're going to be, asked in perhaps exams. You're going to be held responsible for this. But I'm just going to give you a brief overview of some of these drugs. Kind of like if you've had intro to addictions, you know these. I want to show you this here. This is a table representing the most frequent illicit drugs used by the proportion of millions of people. Take a look at the very top. Of course, the most popular illicit drug is marijuana. Marijuana is still an illegal drug, and we'll get into that conversation probably another time, but marijuana is the most used. Second most is pain relievers, which can include non-prescribed painkillers such as codeine, hydrocodone, oxycontin, opioids. If you know anything about opioids, you know that people are misusing them even if they're prescribed. So that's the second most. Tranquilizers. So if you take a look at the names on this chart, and when you think of drugs, you might think of your crack, cocaine, that kind of stuff. But if you take a look at it, it's not really what's used. Now this is national data. This is all around the country. This is the most popular drugs that are being used and that you should really be aware of for yourself and family and others is not crack, it's not cocaine, it's not meth, not heroin, it's marijuana, painkillers, and other types of prescription or pills. All right, let's talk about alcohol. Alcohol, here's a quote from the textbook: alcohol has existed longer than all human memory. Alcohol is pretty much a part of us. It's integrated in just about every culture in the world. Alcohol is a drug, and if you look at the definition of the term drug, alcohol is there. What it is a psychoactive depressant, and when we talk about alcohol, we're talking about ethanol or ethyl alcohol. We're not talking about other types of alcohol like rubbing alcohol. You can't get a psychoactive effect on drinking rubbing alcohol. So we mean ethanol. It's not viewed as a drug. A lot of people don't think of alcohol as a drug. It is. Now you know that. But people don't. Why don't people assume alcohol is a drug? Well, it could be for several reasons. Mostly these four. Alcohol is legal to buy, legal to purchase, legal to have, and it's always promoted. It's drinking. Alcohol is normalized. And it's just been a part of our country and our culture for so long. It doesn't seem like that's going to change. All right, cocaine. Cocaine was it's derived from the cocoa plant, usually in South America. Indians used to use this to give them energy, and what man has done, is we took this plant, took the ingredient, and synthesized it into a powder, which is a lot stronger. And looking at the 19th century, the 1800s, so late 1800s, some of you psychology students, you might be familiar with Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was a major cocaine user, and he believed that cocaine could be helpful in his psychoanalysis, not just for himself, but his patient as well. and then it was one of the ingredients in early Coca-Cola, and people were becoming addicted to it because people didn't believe that cocaine was addictive, and they didn't believe cocaine was a drug, and then back 100 and so on years ago, people didn't really believe that the stuff was harmful. And then there's the third era of cocaine use, which was more recent. It's the 1980s, where cocaine was done by celebrities and rich people. It was kind of a higher status drug. If you ever have a chance to watch any movies from the 1980s, there's probably a lot of cocaine use going on in those movies. So uh, if you and then we have crack, which crack came out as an alternative to cocaine, and it's actually more potent, but it was sold cheaper, and it's something that affected a lot of the poorer people, mostly African Americans, Hispanics, become really addicted to freebase or crack cocaine, which is right there. Again, it's still out there. A lot of people do use it, but it's not one of the biggest problems in this country. This is one of the biggest problems of this country. This is heroin and opiates. Um, Heroin, well, the first heroin was really synthesized after morphine. It's derived from opium that's released by the poppy plant, and opium was used as a pain reliever. Uh, we synthesized it into morphine, and with the advent of the hypodermic needle, people were able to inject themselves with morphine to instantly relieve pain when something terrible happened, some injury. And then people can easily become dependent on any type of pain reliever. So whether it's heroin, those are Oxycontin pills right there in the middle. They all work the same. Oxycontin, painkillers, Tylenol 3, Vicodin, all that stuff. Uh, as far as your central nervous system is concerned, it all works the same in your brain. And people have been wildly misusing and becoming dependent on opioids, especially prescribed opiates. Down there at the bottom, you'll see a picture side by side of the lethal amount of heroin compared to the lethal amount of fentanyl, which is way less. Fentanyl is it's a type of opiate. Also, it's a medical opiate, but it's something that you'll see more and more. More heroin is cut with fentanyl in it, and this is leading to a lot of overdoses and a lot of deaths all over the country. You might not hear about it if you live here in the valley, but it's happening all over this country. There's a lot of fentanyl in heroin. As a counselor, I knew about fentanyl, but I never really thought I'd see the day where people were willingly abusing fentanyl because of how strong it was. I really didn't think we'd get to that point, but it's happening. Fentanyl is what killed Prince. That's why Prince overdosed and died. Marijuana. I don't know how much I have to discuss marijuana. I think we're all kind of familiar with marijuana. It's a cannabis sativa plant. The active ingredient in marijuana, it's THC. It's used in many different forms. Do we have a long American history with marijuana? You can read that in the textbook. It is still illegal despite what some recent states in the country have passed. It is very much illegal. The government considers it an illegal drug, so it's categorized as an illegal drug. And we'll talk about marijuana later on. All right, amphetamines. Now we're going to talk about drugs that are not necessarily naturally derived, because amphetamines are mostly chemically made, man-made. They're stimulants. There are some prescription pills that are amphetamines. For example, like anybody who's been prescribed Ritalin or Adderall or even diet pills sometimes. I know I've been told by many that you can go to Mexico and get diet pills. Their regulation is a lot different than ours, but many of those diet pills from Mexico are amphetamines. That's how they work. They're stimulants. They suppress your appetite. They do cause a rush, alertness, but then there is a major drawback because, of course, people can become dependent on them, very addicted to them. Next type of drug is amphetamines. These are, I'm sorry, these are hallucinogens. These are also chemically derived. They're man-made. They're one type. The most common type was probably the one created by Albert Hofmann. He created LSD in a lab, and LSD ecstasy is also a type of hallucinogen. Mescaline is the active ingredient in peyote, which the Native American church can use if somebody is a card-carrying member of the Native American church. They can use peyote for ritualistic purposes. Timothy Leary was a psychologist, actually. Those of you psychology majors, read up on Timothy Leary. He was a psychologist at Harvard. He was actually a brilliant man, but he was a major proponent for LSD and kind of formed a league of spiritual discovery because he really believed LSD could help in therapy. And then tobacco, I don't think I have to spend a lot of time talking about tobacco either. We pretty much know at this point a lot about tobacco, cigarettes, and all the health problems that they cause. So I'm just going to go ahead and move on. And of course, it's a big deal. Okay, so people use drugs. What's the big deal, really? Why do we care? Why can't somebody just seclude themselves and just use as many drugs as they want? It's not hurting anyone. It's not hurting anybody except the person. So just let them do whatever they want. Well, that's not really the case. And here's why. As long as we live within society, we're all tied into each other. We're all connected to each other in some way. And the only way somebody could, ideally, if they want to, they can go live off on an island by themselves and just use as much drugs as they want to, and that's something totally different. But as long as they're residing within a culture and society, here's what happens. People's drug use affects other people. It does, really. The main reason is because of healthcare. Say somebody starts having health problems or overdoses, needs to go to the hospital, the emergency room. Okay, they'll get treated, but who's going to pay for that? And it affects us, actually. If the person doesn't have any health insurance, or even if they do have health insurance, it drives up the rates of other people's health insurance. And we are all connected to each other because of this. And then here's the other reason. Well, the major conception is that people who use drugs are probably just losers and they don't work and all they do is stay at home, and that's not always the case. A lot of people who use drugs actually do work, but they miss work or they miss production, and that affects all of society also. So there really is no vacuum in which a person can just use drugs all they want and nothing bad will happen to everyone else. People's drug use affects everyone else. And a reflection of that is here. This is the kind of a pie chart of how much money we spend because of drugs. And take a look at that. A third, if any of you all are criminal justice majors, about a third of the budget concentrated towards drugs goes to law enforcement. So again, people's drug use and their consequences affect all of us. Here's another thing, that infectious diseases, which are not just STDs, but all other types of infectious diseases that are not necessarily because of sex. For example, hepatitis C can be spread just by using and sharing needles with other people. HIV/AIDS, we know that, of course. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and end with a couple of things about the profession of substance use counseling. Now, I myself, which I mentioned, I'm an LCDC here in Texas, and some of you might want to pursue that career also, and I hope that you do. I encourage you all to, if that's what you feel. However, I understand it might not be for everyone. Some of you might be taking this course as an elective, and that's fine. I really hope that you understand a couple of issues related to becoming a substance abuse counselor, even if that's not what you want to do. What we have to get right, first of all, are some of the terms and the terminology that we use in the profession. So, substance or chemical. When we talk about that, we include different drugs, of course, but alcohol as well. Alcohol is a substance, so alcohol is included in that. Especially in this course, when we talk about, for example, addiction counseling, well, we don't really mean like behavioral addictions. We don't mean like addiction to pornography or addiction to gambling or stuff, although we will kind of touch on that later. But primarily we're talking about chemical addiction. All right, so let's be clear. ATOD is just an acronym for alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. You might see this on several documents, several articles that refer to substance use. Drug, again, so we can clear what is a drug. It is anything that alters structure, function, or perception in the user. So drug has nothing to do with legality. It has nothing to do with whether it's legal or not. A drug is something that will change your perception. So it can be a legal drug like the prescriptions. Okay, so start thinking about that. Usually when we think of the term drug, we think of something that's illegal. Nope. From that chart I showed you earlier, you can see that many people are doing things that are legal just as much as illegal. And there's a couple of other terms. Drug of choice. From the perspective of the drug user, that's usually what they prefer over all other drugs. Drug user also a person who takes legal or illegal drugs to alter his perception, functioning, or state of consciousness. So again, doesn't matter what the type of drug is. If it's a drug, which includes alcohol, the person can be referred to as a drug user or substance user. Tolerance. So here we're going to talk about tolerance, what that means. Actually, tolerance is not dependence necessarily, but we can develop a tolerance. For example, drinking. Okay, whether you've drank or not, if you have drank, however, you might experience tolerance, which means that you're a couple of things. You start drinking maybe 1 or 2 drinks, but if you keep drinking every weekend, your tolerance might increase, and it increases actually really easily for alcohol users. So what does that mean? Well, one definition of tolerance is metabolic tolerance that refers to liver function, which means that your liver is adjusting how much you drink, and it can process it faster, and you might need more, which means you can drink more, basically, if your liver begins functioning at a certain rate. It'll cause damage later on, but you can keep doing that, and your liver will break down the alcohol faster so that you can drink more. The other type of tolerance is pharmacodynamic tolerance, which is the sensitivity of the chemical to your brain. So that means you might need more amounts of alcohol in order to get that buzz feeling that people crave so often. And then finally, withdrawal. Withdrawal is when you cease the use of a substance, and that can lead to certain types of complications. Here's the last slide. This is information about the history of the profession, about substance use counseling, if you're interested. It is really something that's fascinating for me because substance use counseling came about really quickly. For a long time, people didn't believe in substance use counseling. People didn't believe that people needed counseling for addiction. Then all of a sudden, in 1970, you take a look right there, the government passed this Treatment Rehabilitation Act, which created drug programs, which is good. But then because so long they didn't believe that people needed counseling, they had to quickly scramble and put together credentials for counseling and what that meant. So the first people who became counselors didn't really need a degree, didn't possess any kind of credentials. They were mostly just the people who had gone through addiction and recovery themselves. And then what we learned is that we need all of this so far, like education and practicum skills and everything else behind it. So that's kind of in a rough way to phrase up how our profession came to be. And I'm going to go ahead and end there. I hope you all learned something in chapter 1. If it's mostly review for you all, that's great. Don't forget to do your discussions. Take care.